Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today my guest is Neal Masia, CEO and co-founder of Entity Risk and a leading health economist. Welcome, Neal.
Thank you, Nicole. Nice to say hello.
So we're now 6 long months, some might say, into the second Trump administration, and there are as yet lots of unknowns, ranging from how drug pricing will be handled to the ongoing dismantlement of Biden's policies, as well as those individuals whom Trump has put in charge of healthcare, already altering the FDA and potentially access to care. So today, Neal and I will be discussing the potential scenarios that might arise from the seemingly endless list of changes taking place. Now, Neal, I know you were previously chief economist for Pfizer, but before we dive into today's topic, I was wondering if you could share with listeners a little bit more about yourself and the journey that's taken you to today.
The winding journey. Sure. Happy to do that, Nicole. I'm an economist, as you said. I started my career in Washington back in the Paleolithic era in the 1990s. I was at the Congressional Budget Office and did some work in politics and consulting, and then went to a startup, but eventually found my way to Pfizer and spent the better part of 18 years at Pfizer doing all kinds of different jobs. I was a policy person, then I became a strategy person, then I became a finance person, then I became a policy person again. And then eventually they made up this job where I was the chief economist, and I had oversight or involvement in a lot of really interesting activities, including business development and deals that we did. I was involved with our international finance and treasury world. Eventually, I had global pricing and real world data and analytics and various other things on my team. So I had a really broad view into all the nooks and crannies of the pharmaceutical industry, both from a policy standpoint and a business standpoint. Very lucky to have a chance to kind of see it all over my 18 or 19 years there. And I left in 2019, and soon afterward started Entity Risk with my partners, Darius Lakdawala and Dana Goldman. Somewhere in there around 2012 or so, I started teaching health policy at Columbia University. So I teach undergrads and I teach in the business school. So I have a small army of people who've sat through a whole semester listening to me talk like the way we'll be talking for the next half an hour. And that's been a lot of fun and also a good source of talent for Entity Risk. So dual purposes there.
Thank you, Neal. So a winding journey indeed. And perhaps we'll come back to some more of those nooks and crannies of pharma as regards policy and business. But going perhaps off the back of your recent position at Columbia University, I believe your own story has also been and is being read by startups, investors, and large biopharma companies as they decide how to value and proceed with new therapies. So, firstly, is that correct? And if so, please tell us the overarching whys and wherefores.
Sure, that is correct. So Entity Risk, the idea of Entity Risk was really that the way that society thinks about how to value new drugs or any kind of new innovation in healthcare is very variable across the globe. There are some very strict ways of thinking about it in Europe, and there are, the U.S. market. We've never had a formal way of thinking about, what should a drug cost. We sort of let the market decide to some degree, although there are some real distortions. But the US market, which is the biggest market, is clearly moving toward one where there is going to be some reckoning around value and price. And it's been going there for the last 5 to 10 years. The challenge in the US is nobody knows exactly how that's going to happen. It's sort of your class, we know what we hate. We hate strict, measures like the quality adjusted life year, for example, which is popular in Europe, is very unpopular here because it discriminates against the old and the disabled. But we're not sure what we like or what we can live with. And so it's just a system in flux. And over the last several administrations, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, there's been this push toward let's think about drug prices in a comprehensive sort of government imposed way. What we wanted to do at Entity Risk was say, look, the way that the world has viewed drug prices in Europe in these kinds of systems is quite inadequate for the US market for any number of reasons. Here in the US, it's likely to evolve in some different way using new ways of thinking about value that are more comprehensive. At least we hope so. Generalized ideas, generalized risk adjusted cost effectiveness methods that aren't really in vogue outside of the US, we think have a real chance in the US to gain in popularity. And the challenge with that, one challenge that we see is that people don't, the consulting firms and others who do this work with the drug companies just don't know how to do the math or really innovate around the edges to think about different ways of thinking about value. We've gone down a path of building software that crystallizes and makes sort of feasible much more rigorous ways of thinking about value. And we've built that software over the last 4 or 5 years. And now companies large and small, are using it to think about how to design their late stage clinical trials, what price they think they should be able to charge in the US and around the world using broader definitions of value, maybe even going into risk based contracts around the key elements that we see in the value of their products. And so we're trying to help companies be more efficient with that work, give them new tools that they can use to assess where they are in their development, prioritize across assets. Investors, same story. So it's a really innovative way to do a lot of work around value without having to hire an army of consultants to do it.
Absolutely. And we'll come back to some of the finer details on that during this conversation as well. But sort of springboarding off this notion of doing the math and navigating the edges, let's go tunnel down now into the 340B program, if that's all right. So the 340B program, overseen by the Health Resources and Services Administration, which is an HHS sub-agency, has enabled covered entities to stretch scarce federal resources as far as possible, reaching more eligible patients and providing more comprehensive services. But hospitals and pharmaceutical companies are frequently at odds over 340B. The program was founded 3 decades ago to lower drug prices for safety net providers, but can result in discounts of between 20 and 50% of list prices, cutting significantly into manufacturers' profits. And indeed, Eli Lilly, Bristol Myers Squibb, Sanofi, and Novartis all sued the government after the HRSA blocked their plans to pay hospitals rebates to defray the full cost of 340B medications after the drugs have already been acquired. But a DC district court backed up the HRSA. So some challenges, to say the least, then, Neil. But can I ask you, what are your thoughts here?
Well, tunneling down the 340B program, I mean, that is a tunnel that you can tunnel your way to the other side of the earth in that tunnel. So probably the favorite lecture I give every semester is about 340B. So I won't give you the whole lecture now, but the short answer on 340B, I've done a lot of work on it myself, is that it's a perfect example of unintended but predictable policy outcomes from a program that was, well intentioned 30 years ago, but has clearly morphed into something very different over the last 30 years, and especially over the last 12 years. So really starting in 2012, 2013, the program just began to grow exponentially as people began to solve some changes on the regulatory side that enabled more covered entities to get involved, and then contract pharmacies, which are, mostly for-profit pharmacies that are connecting themselves into the program. So the way I would explain it is, here you had a program that was meant to help about 32 hospitals in the year 1992, because there was a thought that they would be missing out on discounts that were going to become available for the Medicaid program, because there were sort of these special kinds of hospitals that weren't eligible to participate. And those 32 hospitals were meant to be able to buy drugs at a discount, a similar discount to the way the Medicaid program gets discounts. 33 years later, they're buying something like $80 billion worth of inventory at those low, low prices. So I'm pretty sure that's not just 32 hospitals, it's actually about 2,600 hospitals now. The majority of not for profit hospitals are in the program. And then also federal grantees are in the program in the thousands. And so it's become this sort of permeating something like 15 or 20% of the entire US market is covered by this 340B program, which is largely invisible to patients. Basically, the covered entities buy the drugs very cheap. Could be a 50% discount, could be an 80% discount, could be a 99% discount. And then they get reimbursed at full price but from the insurance companies, including Medicare and commercial insurance companies, and also cash pay customers. There's no requirement that the covered entities do anything in particular with their profits from the program. So you have some small hospitals, struggling hospitals that are, that this program is the only thing standing between them and oblivion. But then you also have some of the richest hospitals in the world earning billions of dollars in profits and additionally earning billions of dollars in profits from the 340B program because it's just a golden opportunity. If you've got a person sitting in a chemotherapy chair getting an immunotherapy and you can claim them as a 340B patient, that one day might be worth tens of thousands, if not more, dollars in profit to the hospital. So how does that relate to this whole drug pricing conundrum? Well, all drug prices in the US are sort of interconnected in various ways. So, for example, the 340B program price can't be any higher than the Medicaid price. The Medicaid price automatically includes whatever your best commercial discount is. Okay, plus an adjustment for inflation. So people think of a drug company as picking a price, but when they pick that price, they're basically picking a whole ecosystem of prices that are going to link to that one fateful pricing decision. And because more and more of the system is completely interconnected, so now in Medicare, for example, there's the inflation penalties. So even within the US market, if you get the price wrong when you launch the drug, you are forever stuck with that price. And 340B, for example, plays an important part of how stuck you are because you can never raise the price beyond the rate of inflation. That's for sure. And because it'll just come back to you, you have to give that back anyway. And from a competitive standpoint, that leads to just this incredibly high pressure decision upon launch, which is what is the right price to charge? Now, so we get a lot of inquiries and a lot of the work that we do is to make sure companies are choosing a price that is reflective of the value, what they think the right value of the drug is, and also recognizes the practical market considerations that I just described. And what I just described is just a sliver. But, understanding the cascading effects of your price choice is something that we specialize in. Now, layer on top of that, that's just the domestic version. If you layer in some of the ideas that have been put forward in recent months around, for example, most favored nation pricing, now you're taking a 10-dimensional chess game and turning it into a infinitely dimensional. It just gets very, very recursive and hard to follow. So that's why we think our tools are so useful to the companies, is just because there's so many ways to get your price wrong and very few tools to give you the confidence as a board or as the head of a business to say like, yes, I feel great about this price. I've turned it upside down. I've used in our case, machine learning tools and all kinds of rigorous statistical ways of thinking about this price so that at least I know I've done all I can to understand the value that I'm anticipating delivering to patients. And maybe I'm going to have to actually go at risk for those outcomes. And we see that more and more as well. So long answer to a crazy program, 340B.
And perhaps not long enough, given how complicated it all is, as you said there, as regards to the most favored nation pricing, infinitely dimensioned. So, before we come to the key question of this podcast, which will circle around the risk based contracts that entity risk works with, I just want to also bring up the topic of pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs. So, most listeners will be aware of PBMs, but for those who perhaps aren't, PBMs play a critical role in the US healthcare system, managing prescription drug benefits for insurers government programs, and employers. However, the industry faces growing scrutiny over pricing transparency, rebate structures, and patient access to medications. And this year, as no doubt needs no further preamble for most, the PBM landscape has been undergoing significant transformation driven by regulatory changes, AI integration, and transparency initiatives. So, Neil, I'm going to hand this over to you, this topic. Can you provide your insights and projections about the PBM landscape going forwards?
The PBMs, the Frankenstein's monster of the drug industry. So rampaging through the landscape. PBMs can play an important and useful role. And I think the challenge is that the entire edifice that's built around the PBMs has become sort of a Rube Goldberg mechanism for chaos in the industry. And the healthcare system more generally. Most of the listeners will have heard about what people have called the gross to net bubble. Just there are list prices and then there's the net price. And people in the industry know that while list prices have gone up and up, it's basically been in service to more and more, making the playing field for discounts bigger and bigger. So the net price for most drugs is flat to down over recent years, but the gross price goes up. That's the headline price. So it's as if, all car manufacturers have been just raising their list prices just for the sake of offering bigger discounts to people. The difference is that as a consumer, you wouldn't really care if you were the one keeping all of the discount at the car dealership because there's nobody in between you and the car dealership. So if they all want to have higher list prices and try to fool you with a bigger discount because the net result is all you care about is what you pay. When it comes to the drug industry, the people in the middle who are negotiating those discounts keep a big chunk of the discounts. And so they're always rooting for the highest possible list price so that they can negotiate the biggest possible discount and keep a big piece of it for themselves. And that's really been, that's sort of, if I were teaching an economics 101 class, like on, or maybe an incentive a class on incentives, you would say, well, of course the list price is going to keep going up. The net price is not changing, but somebody in the middle is basically siphoning off a growingly significant share of the money. I've seen data that say something like half of the list price doesn't actually go to the drug companies. It goes to all these various intermediaries, largely the PBMs, and to some extent, those covered entities from earlier that we talked about in the 340B program. If you were designing a system from scratch, I don't think you would wind up with the one that we have. I think I don't think you'd have a hard time finding anybody to disagree with that statement. So when we look at the PBMs, the headline stories are, look, they will claim that they are saving money. They are saving money on an absolute basis off of the list prices that exist today. Those list prices are what they are largely because of the PBMs. So some would say, don't put the arsonists in charge of the fire department. I think they certainly are full of well-meaning people, but they make their money by negotiating discounts. So the higher the list prices, the more money they can make. And that's just, the drug companies don't have much choice but to go along with that system. It's a classic game theory conundrum. They can't get out of the prisoner's dilemma. So PBM reform is on the table. It has been on the table for about as long as I've been in this industry, which is eons. So it's always there. The problem is once you're in this sort of spot that we're in, how do you reform the PBMs in such a way that you don't break other parts of the system? And that's what I think the nature of the negotiations is. And we'll see. We'll see how much appetite there really is for changing it. It's really hard for the average voter or even the average healthcare consumer to piece any of this together. It's just so complicated. Like all the little details, I can spend an entire semester explaining them to my students, but it's not like they all get 100 at the end of the semester on the test. It's very, there's just a lot of details and there's elements of it that I'm sure I don't understand, and it's just the challenge for voters again is what all they really see is what they pay when they show up at the drugstore, which is the end part of this whole thing. So there's been all these, like, the ball has been dropping through the thing in 25 different directions. And then finally you show up at the drugstore and maybe that day it's $25 and maybe it's $125. And you're more upset if it's 125 than it's 25. And then maybe the pharmacist can explain, oh, it's because you're in your deductible. Okay. So maybe they understand that. But then, last month it was X, this month it's Y. There's no other product I purchased that's like that I'm purchasing all the time. So it's just so confusing. And if you're a consumer, the people you really understand is whose name is on the bottle of pills I just took. It's the manufacturer. I understand that somehow they're behind all of this. And so, it's easy to get upset and lose sight of the longer term consequences of some of these PBM industry practices and just broader efforts at reform.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, as you say, it's just so complicated and it leads to confusion for the consumer, but also some within industry itself. So let's go towards entity risk now. What role here, with everything we've been discussing today, with all this uncertainty that doesn't seem to be abating, what role here for risk based contracts?
So risk-based contracts have been actually probably more popular in Europe lately than in the US. But the theory is as follows. For the higher priced drugs, let's call them, especially gene therapies, cell therapies, some of the oncology products, I think they tend to launch with relatively limited data just by nature of what they're treating, rare disease. And this is an area where actually, the new FDA commissioner, Marty McCary, has been very clear that he's trying to make this go even faster for rare disease drugs. You're just not going to have all that much historical data on some of these treatments, especially for conditions where, it's desperate and the patient really needs that treatment ASAP. So the challenge is that payers and others in the ecosystem are, being asked to lay out very significant sums to try a treatment that may or may not work. It may have worked on a handful of patients or maybe a larger number of patients, but there's always going to be some variability in the outcomes. And so the answer to that would be contracts where, in effect, the payer doesn't pay unless the drug does what it's supposed to do, or at least they don't pay the full price. Maybe they pay something, and if the drug doesn't work, there's some amount of money that's refunded or some amount of money that isn't charged down the road. Those kinds of contracts have a lot of appeal in areas where it's just not clear which patients it's going to work for or how long the drug is going to work, for example. And so there's always been appetite. But there have been a number of challenges. But one important challenge is just that our system is not set up for those kinds of arrangements to occur naturally, partly because of that whole interconnected web of prices I talked about earlier. If I give a refund, for example, on one drug, does that mean that I have to give the refund to all the other government parts of the government ecosystem? And there have been policies trying to address that, some pilot programs. The bigger issue, I think, though, is that everybody's just afraid of the risk because they can't, they themselves don't know. So for example, if you're a very small drug company and you're launching this exciting new gene therapy, you can say you're going to guarantee the performance. But if the drug doesn't work, your company is probably going to go out of business. And so nobody's going to really believe that guarantee. So there are these frictions that have prevented for the smaller companies, a lot of the exciting gene therapies are smaller companies, from anybody really taking those guarantees too seriously. And then on the larger companies, it's a complicated thing to try to assess how much risk they're taking on by going at risk for these treatments themselves. So they're trying to work with the payers in these sort of areas of, hey, maybe if it doesn't work, I'll give you a refund or you'll stop paying me. But then if you're the CFO of a big drug company or any company really, how do you know how much revenue you're going to really be able to recognize? It becomes very murky. You have these guarantees hanging over your head. So these have all been barriers to adoption, right? And these kinds of arrangements also tend to leave out the patients and the providers from the equation. So, you've got the payer and the drug company, maybe they can come to some agreement, but you still have everybody else in the system taking on risk, like the patients, the providers. Providers aren't used to laying out millions of dollars to keep inventory on a gene therapy, for example. So it's an industry that's crying out for solutions. We think some of those problems are solvable, but it takes a level of analytics that hasn't really been brought to bear until now. So what we thought needed to happen was somebody needed to build tools using Bayesian statistics, which just means using the kind of statistics that take advantage of very small samples of data, where you can wring every last drop of information out of each and every patient's data and try to get a better sense, an ongoing sense for how likely the drug is to work over a longer period of time. So, what we call duration, which kinds of patients are likely to benefit sooner versus later from different therapies, model all those things, build tools that everybody can agree do the best job at predicting the likely risk, and then build contracts around those tools. We're doing that now actively with a number of companies, and, it's a very different way of thinking about it because traditionally, the companies haven't really gone at that. They haven't taken on that much risk for performance with a few exceptions. We're excited for that work. We think it can smooth a pathway for access to these exciting new treatments because it kind of brings everybody to the table and gives them a stake in the success, including the drug companies, but also the payers.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, certainly a smooth pathway to access to these treatments is crucial. And so, finally, the last question of today's conversation. We've spoken a lot, but what's your summative statement or takeaway, rather, for listeners today who want to safeguard for a very much as yet unknown tomorrow? It's a big question.
Keep your head on a swivel. Listen, I mean, my summative statement is that as long as I've been in this industry, which is now 30 plus years, I cannot remember any time where everybody didn't think the world was in a state of chaos. Okay, I cannot remember any time when that was not the case. So having a little perspective is helpful. I think that there are policies. There are always good and bad policy proposals on the table. There's never been a time where everybody said, "Oh, this is a great idea. Let's do it." I remember when the Medicare drug benefit was passed in 2003 or 2004, whatever that was. It was revolutionary, this idea that seniors should have drug coverage. And it was there were people on both sides. You say, "Oh, I don't know." Things that seem obvious in retrospect at the time don't always seem so obvious. I think that if you look at the US market, the biggest market in the world, US government is the biggest purchaser in the biggest market in the world. I think it is crazy to think that eventually, that in 10 years, 20 years, that the US government won't have a forced expressed opinion about value. They clearly will, but there's still time to shape how we think about value and to make it uniquely an American way of thinking about value, which is with an eye toward the long run, with an eye toward patient preferences, not discriminating against patients for their pre-existing, disabilities, all of which are things that European systems fall short of. And so I don't think that it's going to be that we simply import strict price controls from other countries and just apply them here. That would be very foolish. But I do think that eventually we're going to have some way that we think about, that we articulate our opinion about value. We already express an opinion about value through the market prices that show up in the US. So I think we have to take those prices seriously and take what they mean about how patients value health seriously, and really think broadly about the value of new drugs and the long-term value that they create within our system, which is a unique system that still has many of the best elements in the world, even though it's frustrating to a lot of people. So I guess I would say over time, we will see a movement more toward value. How that value is assessed is up in the air, is up for debate. Companies would do very well to put their best foot forward and show the kind of value, these comprehensive ways of thinking about value, rather than wait for a regulator to tell them what to do. And we're ready to help companies do that every day.
Thank you, Neil, for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Nicole.
And that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, Podbean, and pretty much wherever else you download your other podcasts from. Just search for pharmaphorum and follow and hit subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us on Blue Sky and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.